helps with the video for all of our parents who aren't able to be with us this morning. So thank you for you being here, because I know it's such a busy time of year, and you have a lot of other things you could be doing. We are doing our last one of this semester on the role of testing, and we've added a couple things to that. Last year, if you came, it was called the role of the SAT and ACT in college admissions, and this time we've kind of expanded it to talk about other things as well. So again, welcome. Today, the two counselors who are going to be speaking to are Ms. Sabolos and Mr. Johnson, but we have all the other counselors in the back as usual. And when we're finished at 9, we will have time for you to speak to us if you have additional questions. So thank you so much for coming.
So as Mrs. Gallant said, we're going to talk about the role of testing in college admissions. We'll try to make it as exciting as we can, we promise. So really, why scores matter. Taken from the College Board. So colleges use scores in their admissions decision, obviously, right? But they also understand that it's one test on one test date. So their grades are more important than that, but obviously the test score does play a role, right? The more selective, the more competitive the school, the more that test score will probably come into play for the student. Colleges will go ahead and publish their test scores on their website, so you can find that information as well in terms of their mid-range. Always remember that students get in above and below that range as well, but it's nice just to have that additional information. Scores let colleges find students, so don't panic about this, but it's really more based if the student elects for their scores to be shared, or they sign up for those emails. Remember, there's a business side of this as well, and that's kind of where this is coming into play. So don't panic about that. Colleges may use scores for scholarships as well, so sometimes the test scores via specific schools will allow them to be considered for scholarships or earn scholarships based off of their test scores, and or sometimes their GPA as well. Colleges will consider scores in different ways. So typically colleges do like to see all of the students' test scores, right? They're using test scores to really help them in the admissions process, not hinder them. Sometimes it's hard for students to digest that, or parents to think, yeah, right? Like there's gonna be some hidden agenda here. They wanna see it, but it's gonna hurt them. But they tell us all the time, we talk to reps all the time, and they tell us the same thing, like, we really wanna see them all because we really wanna help them get into the school. Other schools will take the highest overall from one testing day. So if they took it multiple times, whatever their highest overall is, that's the one they're gonna focus on. And then other schools will do what they call super score, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But that's where if the student took it multiple times, they would go ahead and take their highest from each section. So if they had higher sections from different test dates, they would use that and recombine and use that as their test score. So what matters most to colleges? So we are going to talk a lot about testing, but again, like I said, their academics, their GPA, their grades, really is what matters most in the admissions process, right? Because that highlights them over a greater span of time versus one test on one test date. Colleges recognize that, they know that. They're also looking for that rigor, right? So have they maintained rigor? Have they increased rigor? Has their GPA gone up? Are they able to show that progression upward? Maybe they started off really strong and they were able to maintain that, and there wasn't much room for that growth, right? They're a 4-point-something kind of student. Maybe they had a really rough freshman year. They got a 3.0, but sophomore year came along and they have a 3.8. They build upon that junior and senior year. Again, that helps speak to the student and their ability in the admissions process. And then also, colleges will slice and dissect the transcript however they want. They all do their own thing. We wish they followed a cookie-cutter formula, but unfortunately they don't. So I've met with a couple seniors recently in the past week, and they came in as they're doing their Cal State app, and they said, Ms. Voles, something must be wrong. Like, my Champlain GPA is not the same as my Cal State GPA. And I was like, no, that's correct. It's based off of sophomore and junior year grades, so it's gonna look a little bit different. It's also only calculating in the A through G requirements for them, right? So they're not taking classes and like religion into consideration in that GPA. So breakdown of the ACT. So the structure for the ACT and SAT are pretty similar. The sections do vary, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But they are both curriculum-based exams. So there is that shift with the new SAT that came out not that long ago. So English, math, reading, and science is what we have on the ACT. So the main differences are on math, there's a little bit of trig on the ACT, it's only up to Algebra 2 on the SAT, and the science section on the ACT. There's no science on the SAT, but science in terms of interpreting data, graphs, charts, they're not computing chem problems or physics problems. So sometimes when students hear that, they breathe a little bit easier. Also, there's a writing section that's optional. However, when we say optional, we really mean go ahead and take it. It's not really optional. And that's because some schools require it, the student didn't take it, they're left taking the whole exam over again as well. So it's good just to go ahead and take it. For the SAT, so it's broken down a little bit differently. There's a writing section and a reading section, and then there's the math section is broken down into two parts, a calculator and a non-calculator part. And again, that optional essay really isn't optional. They should go ahead and sign up to take it with writing. The scoring guideline for each of the tests. So the SAT is at a 1600. You can score as low as 400. I haven't seen a score that low ever, but. And then again, the optional essay that they should take is scored separately from the 1600 score, and there's no wrong answer penalty. The ACT is scored 1 through 36. The optional essay again is scored separately, and there's again no wrong answer penalty on that. And then the super scoring, so I briefly already mentioned that, so you can see it, the student here, John, he took it twice. In May, he scored highest in the reading section with a 650, and then in October, he scored higher in the math section with a 650. So a school that super scores is gonna go ahead and take the two 650s and recombine it for a 1300, right? Making it a lot nicer, a little bit higher for the student. The SAT and ACT do get super scored. The SAT is not as, rather the ACT is not as commonly super scored as the SAT is. Sometimes colleges also don't advertise that they're scoring the ACT, or that they're super scoring it rather. And again, we always recommend students to go ahead and send all their scores. It's more of a conversation they can have in senior year with their counselor in terms of what's best for them. But again, like I said earlier, typically colleges do like to see all of those test scores because they're really trying to help them in the admissions process. Passing it on.
Good morning. I'm Daniel Johnson, and I'm going to launch right into subject tests. So subject tests are put on by the College Board, the same company that makes the SAT, and they're tests on specific subjects, usually core academic subjects. English, math, history, science, foreign language, stuff like that. And it can be a little bit confusing about when to take a subject test and when maybe to use your time elsewhere. So let's talk about that a little bit. So first off, they're multiple choice exams in a specific subject area. You can take up to 3 exams on a given date. That can be really important because they're on the same test date as the SAT, and so some students have to decide, well, am I gonna use this test date for the SAT or am I gonna take some subject tests? So it can be important to find out, what your testing center has and what subject tests are offered, and know that you can stack several subject tests in a single testing session. Obviously, if you're taking 3 subject tests, that might be pretty exhausting for some students, so keep that in mind as well. They're not required by most colleges. This has been a shift. A bunch of years ago, all the UCs used to require the subject tests, and they've pulled away from that, and they've said, no, it's not required. And a lot of other schools have done similarly. So if you don't have subject tests, it doesn't put you at a disadvantage. But we'll talk about that a little bit later because some schools are expecting it, some schools really want it. There's some majors that really require it. Oh my gosh, look at this face. Okay, and then we have, it's recommended for students in applicable AP classes who have a strong propensity for a certain area. If a student is in a specific AP class, then it could be very easy for them to demonstrate mastery on a subject test. And so it's kind of a no-brainer to have one more piece of data working for the student. I think that it's even better if maybe a student has a really strength in one area and maybe they didn't have the opportunity to take the AP class. Let's say that it just didn't work in their schedule to take AP biology, but they love biology, they want to go pre-med, they studied all the time, they're going to do great on the test. That way the test shows off to the colleges something that isn't already put into their record. AP classes are great, and those demonstrate mastery in one way, and subject tests are another way to demonstrate mastery of a subject. Oh, look at that. Recommended for students to demonstrate mastery. And then finally, for specific majors, the big one is engineering. We see this all the time. Engineering majors, many of them will require subject tests, specifically in Math 2 and physics. And there might be some other majors out there that will require subject tests. So pay attention to that, because students sometimes look at the requirements for the school and be like, no subject tests, everything's great. And then they figure out that for their major, well, it's strongly recommended, or in some cases required. And so we want to make sure that you're aware of that from the very beginning. All right, so this is the testing sort of schedule that we have at Chaminade, and is mirrored in most schools across the United States. So in the 9th grade, we just have them take sort of the PSAT, the 8-9. So that's just kind of a generic test, and it's geared for the student's level, which means that it doesn't have that Algebra 2 content on it. But it can give the students a good baseline of how they do compared to the national average. Same thing with 10th grade for the ACT Aspire. Again, it's designed for the student level. It's there to give them an idea of how they test, how they're doing against other students. But then as we go into the junior year, we get more specific. It gets more targeted towards the types of tests that they're going to be taking in preparation for college. So in the spring or the fall of the 11th grade, they'll take the PSAT. So the PSAT is very much a practice SAT. Some people put a lot of emphasis on doing well on it. And in most situations for most students, it's just practice. It's there to get feedback. They'll get a score report back that says where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, especially in certain subjects. Student might realize that actually they're not that good in geometry. They forgot a lot about it. And this PSAT can reveal that information so that they can make up for it a little bit later. The one area that the PSAT can give a huge advantage is if your student's scoring very high, like 99th percentile, then they could get a scholarship, get recognition because of the PSAT. And that's really good. That could be a big boost. So some students that know that they're testing high, maybe from these previous tests, they've been in the 95th, 98th, 99th percentile, and they know that they could achieve that score on the PSAT. Many of those will study very hard and try to get that National Merit Scholarship and try to get that recognition from the test. Okay. But the most important part is that the PSAT is there to gather more information to help formulate a study plan. Then in the spring of the 11th grade, we suggest you begin prep 8 to 10 weeks before the test date. And we have tons of test preparation things available at school, and also you're going to be aware of many other test preparations outside, because this is a big business, this is a large industry, and we recognize that. So things that we have for free, Khan Academy is just free. They've paired with the College Board. They got great YouTube videos, they have free tests, they're interactive, they're wonderful, and we've seen a lot of success with students using them. Did I mention that they're free? Yeah. Also Shmoop. We have Shmoop, and it sounds weird, but we have this Shmoop test login, and it's available in the counseling office, it's available in the library, and the library pays for it. Chaminade pays for it, so students can use this login information and get into Shmoop and do free test prep through that. Other common things that you might have heard of is stuff like, this is akin to self-study, which can also be just, hey, you bought a book. You know, I bought a book, we're gonna work through the book, or you go online and you download some tests and the student works through some tests. And for a lot of students, that can be really, really effective. For some students that maybe aren't as organized or motivated, then maybe they might need a little bit more structure. And so there are other things that provide some structure. For example, Chaminade is offering test prep now through the Center for Excellence, which is great. We did a pilot program with the PSAT and saw a lot of great results, and now we're running it for normal test preparation, and we're seeing a lot of positive feedback. And so we plan on continuing that program. Now that kind of transitions us into all of the other test prep that exists out there in the world. Some of you might even have gotten some information about starting really early, like 9th grade or 10th grade, or you know, oh, we'll make a 6-month program or something like that. And you might notice the discrepancy between this, what we suggest, which is the 8 to 10 weeks. I feel, all of us feel basically, that there are huge diminishing returns when studying for the SAT. We talk to students all the time, are you studying for your finals yet? They're a month away. They're like, well, maybe, but not really, okay? Studying the actual test-taking strategies and studying for how to take the test and familiarizing yourself with the questions can be done in a relatively short amount of time, and you do want to prepare as you're going into the test. Now that's fundamentally different than making up in the content areas. Remember I explained before about geometry. Maybe they're having weak in geometry. The test prep companies, the Khan Academy, this stuff, they're gonna barely touch on reviewing concepts for geometry. They're not gonna go back and reteach you fractions or reteach you angles or circles or anything like that. They're there for test preparation. And so if a student notices a weakness, then they might want to go back on their own over a longer period of time and cover up those bases in the subject matter. Or do something really good, like make sure that they're studying for their tests and going through school. School's a great preparation for these tests. It really is. Reading is one of the highest, it's one of the highest connectors for performance on these tests. Is just if students read, they tend to do very well on these tests. And so what we want to say, if there's a message for this presentation, is to be very aware of what you're being sold and the scare tactics that are being used, and weigh the pros and cons of any of these preparation. It is important that students prepare. You know, we want them comfortable. We want them to feel good going into the test. We don't want them surprised by any of the types of questions. We want them to have seen those critical reading passages. We want them to know what to look for when the question mentions inference. We want them to know how to find vocabulary and context. We want them to be familiar with the types of math questions, even though they might not know the exact numbers involved. We want them super familiar and to feel safe and really good. And we also want them going in knowing, hey, I score about between here and here when I practice. And so I'm expecting to score in between here and here on the test. Okay? All of that gives the student a lot of confidence, it builds them up psychologically, they've practiced it, they feel comfy, and they will score the best that they possibly can on those kinds of tests. So I think we preach a lot of balance here, and also a lot of information so that you guys can kind of feel out what's the best type of test prep for your kids. Okay, that was a long section right there. But then at the end of the spring, of your junior year, we suggest that they take the test. And take the test for the first time, prepare beforehand, take the test. Many students will be like, yep, I got what I wanted, I prepared, I knew what I was doing, I'm done. That's some students, but a lot of students are like, I can do better. And for the most part, they can. Statistically, if you take the test multiple times, or if you take it later on in your senior year, you will score better. So many students will then study over part of the summer and then take the test in the fall of their senior year as well. There are many test times to take, but we really suggest that you finalize your testing by November of their senior year. There is one more test. That December test will work for the vast majority of schools. So even though the UC and Cal State application deadline is November 30th, students can still take the December 1st test and have it apply for those schools. So we don't want people to rely on that very last test day. That's very nerve-wracking, and that might not work. But one thing that's good for students to know is that, look, if everything goes horrible, if everything goes wrong, there's that December test date too. So there's lots of opportunities for students to take this, and having a plan takes a lot of the anxiety out of it too. because students can carry a lot of anxiety about this. They really can, and it feels like they have so much pressure, especially with students that have test anxiety normally. So we want to try to relieve some of that pressure and making sure that there's a plan in place and that there are contingencies if they have a bad day or if they're sick or something like that. That also helps relieve anxiety. Also, beware testing burnout. You can take a test like every month, and if you're taking the ACT and the SAT, you can take one like twice a month. Okay, that's you don't need to do that much. Like, you don't need to. So be very aware of so much testing, so much prep, so much everything. All right, so I talked about some of those test prep promises, and I alluded to some of the companies that might, try to sell you very elaborate packages. We've already talked about some free testing resources. There are also very, very expensive testing resources. Okay? There are, really, really inexpensive private tutors. There are incredibly expensive ones. There are really bad tutors, and there are very good tutors out there. That's one of the problems, is that there's a wide range in terms of what's out there, and sometimes you'd be paying a lot of money for something that's not that good. Okay? The key that I've had to evaluating what kind of service it is ask a lot of questions. Use the counselors as resources. Okay? You could sign up for, your student up for a class that takes a test every Saturday, and you're like, wow, that sounds great. You're going to take a test every Saturday. It'll be 4 hours, and then they'll review it. That'll be great. But the student could just wake up and take a free test every morning with their phone and a timer and some discipline. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're free. There are SAT tests out there all over the place. You can get tons of them for free. The College Board has 8 full-length gradable practice tests on their website that you can download. Okay? So it's all about asking questions, and we're available to answer those questions for you too. Also, some of these companies, they try to bundle stuff in. So they might give you some SAT prep, but then they want to bundle in some other stuff. And one of the ones that we're very wary of is bundling in college counseling along with it. You have college counselors. We're here. We're available. You have full service counseling at Chaminade. And we've been doing this for years. We're experts at it. And so just know that that is available to you. And it's part of tuition. It's part of the experience at Chaminade. And there's some advantages to using the Chaminade resources that you have. Sometimes, like I said, tutors or advisors like that, sometimes they can be really good. They really can. And other times they're not that good. And that's just what it is. And we don't know. And so that makes us nervous because we don't know the people that your sons and daughters are dealing with. And sometimes the advice is conflicting. Okay? And we don't like that. We don't like it when we're trying to give a student advice that we think is correct, and then you're getting advice from somewhere else and it doesn't match up. Okay. Another thing is that colleges only want to hear from Chaminade counselors. We write their secondary school report. We write their letters of recommendation. We coordinate their file. We communicate directly with their representatives. We have a lot of inroads and access to their college application process that an outside counselor might not have. And so I personally would love to spend as much time as possible with students talking about their college stuff, figuring out what they like and dislike. I want to be a part of their college process, and if all of that conversation is happening outside of school, then I'm missing out on a lot of getting to know your students. And so I want to be a part of that process, and I want to help them through it, and all of the counselors do too. We want to know them really well so that we can best help them. And then also, you already know, Chaminade offers full service college assistance. Okay, let's get back to subject tests. We mentioned some of the strengths and some of the reasons why students would take them. One other reason why students would take them is because they are highly recommended and required by certain schools. So, for example, Dartmouth, Duke, Georgetown, Caltech, Harvard, Harvey-Mudd, Brown, Vassar, Carnegie Mellon, Columbia, Stanford, Princeton, UCLA, UC Berkeley, USC, Yale University, and Georgia, and more. These schools strongly recommend them. As a counselor, when we read strongly recommend, we read required. That's how we do it. And so we really push a lot of students that are applying to those top schools to have a series of subject tests, to have this to bolster their application so they can be competitive against with the other students. And so that could be, if that's your type of student, then subject tests kind of become well, does it fit you? Like, what test fits you really well? How does this add to your profile? And it kind of shifts over into, well, yeah, you need to do it. And so that can be a little bit of a tricky line to navigate, and so we wanted to inform you about that too. Check the school's websites, and then remember certain majors will require them as well. So paying attention to that. Okay, another test, similar to subject tests, AP tests. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions about AP scores and how they're used at colleges. And so I want to clear this up because a lot of students, they get stressed out about this. And they're like, oh, I got a 3 on this AP test. I shouldn't submit them to schools. Or, oh, it's going to look bad, or something like that. Mainly, the most important thing is that, 1, colleges expect you to take the test. They really do. They want you to take the test. Everyone wants you to take the test, okay? They want you to take the test because there's like a huge advantage, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the important thing for students to know is that the grade in the class is the critical component, not the score on the test. Okay, that's what they're looking at. That's what the colleges really want to see, is how you perform across that class. The test is, well, it's in this weird zone where many schools don't look at it at all. They're like, sure, we'll look at it after you're accepted and you decide to go here for college credit, but we're not using it as part of the admissions decision. Some schools are saying like, well, it's a part of your whole profile, it's a part of the whole student, and we look at the whole student, and so, yeah, it's not very important, but we will look at it. Okay? And those are some of the top schools that are saying that, well, it's not really important, but we will look at it. And so that little aspect has a lot of students worried. They're like applying to Stanford or MIT or something like that, and they're like, oh my gosh, they're gonna look at my scores. Okay, it's okay, they can still send the scores. The college admissions officers are trying to find good things to say and to find about your students. It's not going to look bad if they have some AP scores that aren't very good, okay? Because they're designed to be only good. There are huge advantages to getting a passing score, and different schools will have tons of different ways that they'll evaluate those scores. The general rule of thumb is that 3 and higher gets you college credit. That changes wildly across the different schools. I don't want to give any blanket statements, but if students are scoring well, then they can get college credit. And you might think like, oh, college credit, that's good, saves them a class, saves them some money. The advantage of having flexibility and time in college for a student is huge. Just imagine this scenario. They're pre-med and they're taking organic chemistry sophomore year, which apparently just destroys pre-med majors. Apparently it's awful. And everyone hates it, and then their lives are destroyed. But just imagine if they could take 12 units that semester instead of 16 because they have some AP classes. Then suddenly, organic chemistry, they budget 2 class periods for it. There's less work for them to do, and suddenly it becomes a breeze. Just imagine a student being able to double major or add a minor because now they have room in their schedule to add more classes. Imagine a student that can afford to go and study abroad where they can't get exactly the right classes that they need because they have room in their schedule to do that. Some students are like, oh, I can't study abroad, I can't do this program, I can't do this thing because I'll be off track. Well, if you have room in your schedule so that you're not off track, then that gives you other huge advantages. Okay, so we love AP tests. We want students to score really well on them. We want them to take it. And it can be tricky to know exactly how they're applied at different schools because everyone has different rules. And so we'll be able to help the students with their individual situations with AP tests. Overall, it's meant to be positive, not a punishment, and so students don't need to overanalyze this and try to look for problems in their AP test scores. Instead, celebrate the fact that they're taking these great classes and that they're scoring on them well on them. All right, sending test scores. The most important part is that students need to send their own test scores. Counselors can't do it. Okay? It's super easy. They basically just send them electronically at least 2 weeks beforehand. they come directly from the testing agencies. So they come from the SAT or the ACT. The students just like log in, there's a big button that says send your scores, they pick the schools, and whoosh, they get sent through the internet. They charge you $12 before they get whooshed. And then also we tell them 2 weeks too, because some students get freaked out. The SAT actually has like rush through the internet. They have like rush shipping for like $30 or something like that. And so I don't know how you rush things like digitally through to the schools, but apparently that's a thing too. And they can just send them. It's not that hard to send them. So we tell students just send your scores, get them there, because it's an important part of your college application, and it's not a part that the counselors can be involved in, that the student has to send it. And it's not reported on the transcript. So they won't even be unofficial scores for a school to work from. So make sure that those get sent. But it's one thing that you should know is that colleges will accept scores from either exam. Yeah, there isn't one exam that's more important than the other. One thing that you might be hearing a lot more SAT than ACT, just in general, and a lot of that is regional. The SAT is way more popular on the coasts, and the ACT is more popular in the center of the country. So if this presentation was going on, in Kansas, then you would be hearing ACT out of my mouth every single time. But just because you're in California, sometimes things are always put in terms of SAT. They are equally valued at these schools. Yeah?
So I think, I can't even remember when I took my scores, my tests, but you put down the code for the college when you took the test. That was pre-internet, I think.
Good question. So there are,
still to do that?
yes, there is. So basically the SAT, well, I mentioned the paying $12 per sending it. As you sign up for the SAT, you can pre-write down the schools that you want your scores to go to, and you write down their college code, and then they will send a certain amount, three or four. They'll send 4 for free if they know when they're taking the test and they know the school code to write it down. And they can go get sent off immediately for free to those schools. So yes, that is still a thing. Most students don't do that. They just sign up for the test and then they see what their scores are, and then they do all of the sending much later, their senior year. But that is an option. All right, one other thing we have is test optional schools. This is a growing fad, and the reason why is because we know it, college admissions officers know it, the schools know it, everyone knows that the SAT and the ACT is not a good measurement of your students. It's really not, okay? And everyone knows it, but the thing is that it's important. The colleges still use it. It might be a crutch for them to evaluate your students, but they still use it, and so because the colleges value it, we're gonna value it, and we're gonna make sure that your students value those test scores too. But your grades and your activities and your essays and your recommendations, and there's so much more to a student than just their performance for 3 hours on a single day. Okay? And a lot of schools have the resources to be able to say, like, no, we don't like this approach to college admissions. And so many schools are going test optional. You'll find that they're mostly private schools, and they have the resources to be able to really look into a student. But it's growing, and basically they evaluate different aspects of the student, and they just leave out the test component. Just because a school is test optional doesn't mean a student shouldn't send in their test scores. Okay? Sometimes a student's test scores are really good, or they match their academic achievement, and so we're like, yep, just send in your test scores, that's fine. Okay? And then if a student chooses not to send in their test scores to a test optional school, there might be more weight put on other aspects of their academics. So their GPA and their strength of schedule and all these other things might be ratcheted up a little bit in terms of the critical eye that admissions officers put on them. Okay? But test optional is a thing, and we should kind of be aware of it, especially if your student doesn't test very well. One more thing before we move on to questions. I talked a little bit about the stress involved in this. One thing we want to do is remove stress, but just be very aware of it. Your student might be really worried about this test, and we want them to be comfortable, because if they're comfortable, they're going to perform well. Part of being comfortable is practicing and being familiar with stuff. So that's why we tell them, yeah, you need to study, you need to be prepared. One other thing that could be important for your students, or could be not very important, is services for students with disabilities. And if a student is allowed to have extra time on an exam, that can be applied to the SAT and the ACT. Okay? And if you want more information about your student's individual needs, then you can talk to your counselor about that, and we can make sure that you have those accommodations on the SAT or the ACT. There's one thing that you should know. Extra time doesn't always mean a good thing. You can't just skip over certain sections. Like, it becomes a very rigid schedule if a student has extra time. This is already over 3-hour test. Just imagine if the SAT, instead of over 3 hours, becomes over 5 hours. I have many students in the past who were allowed to have extra time, and they say, no, I don't want it on this test. I would rather be rushed on 2 questions than be exhausted for the last hour of this exam. Okay? So it's about your individual student, and it's about what kind of testing they will have. So just keep that in the back of your mind if that applies to you, and it's very individual, so feel free to talk to your counselor individually about that. And now we move on to the section where we answer all of your questions about testing, everything that you ever wanted to know. Yeah?
You mentioned that Shamina now prepares the kids through the Center of Excellence for the testing.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through the process of how a kid gets involved in that? Where do you sign up? That kind of thing? Please?
Yeah, so we're running the session pretty soon, and this is our first session for the SAT that we've ever run, right? That's right. But we've had tremendous success for preparing for the PSAT, and there's been demand, so that's why we're running it. It meets once a week, 8 weeks before, around 8 weeks before the test, so it'll run in the spring. I'm looking at Juliana because I'm confirming it. It's a brand new program.
Yes, it's running for the March program, so it's running soon. And you know, our hope is that keeping it on campus, we will help keep it in perspective. The person who's doing it for us has he's prepped some of our kids for the PSAT in years past and had excellent results, and then he was the one who did the PSAT this year. If any of your students took that prep course, we don't have the results yet, but hopefully with excellent results. And then,
It's on camera too, Juliana.
and I lost my train of thought. But also because a lot of times the test prep companies are ridiculously priced, and they prey on your anxiety as parents and start to offer you packages of other things that you don't really need. We're a full service office here. So we can help because we know your students and know them over 4 years for the most part. Sometimes new counselors catch up really quick, but I am watching him with his students and he really knows them already. We're really blessed. So, you know, we try to help them find the right schools based on their interests and their strengths and those kinds of things. If you go to a test prep company and they start offering you those things, a lot of times it's very cookie cutter. It's for their own marketing to say that they helped a student get into this school, and it's not really based on your kid, and it's thousands of dollars. So keeping it in-house, we can kind of keep all that in perspective, try to keep the anxiety down while hopefully helping with the scores, and it's a win-win. And the cost is effective. I think it's around $300 for the 8 weeks. So right now, the first one that's running is for juniors only, though, and it's full. A double whammy. But we'll be doing it again for the June test. And Mrs. Calgill is who you would reach out to, or if you have more questions on those offerings. She's the director of the Center for Excellence, and that's what we're running it through. There was a hand up.
Does Khan Academy or the Center for Excellence also do prep for subject matter tests?
Yeah, well, Khan Academy does also have some of the stuff. Schmoop does as well. And ultimately, just reviewing some of that stuff, getting a test prep book is pretty good. Hopefully a student doesn't need a lot of intense studying for the test. Hopefully they're ready for those subject tests, but reviewing the materials, getting a book, using those resources, Schmoop and Khan Academy would be really good for that. Yeah?
About the subject tests, generally, the kids know which subject tests they're going to be taking, and so they take them as soon as they've studied that in school? I mean, or is there a special time that you take it?
Yeah, I think that in correlation with the actual class would be the best. So for example, if you have a sophomore that's taking AP World History, they might want to take that AP or that subject test in World History. Same thing with things like chemistry or biology. A lot of students naturally will push those subject tests into their senior year because they know they need to take math too, and so they're like, let's get as much math as possible into my brain before I have to take that math 2 subject test. Same thing goes with physics. Those are going to be the most popular because we got a lot of engineering students around here, and that's where the requirement of subject tests lies. So it depends on the individual student and where they are in academics for when they should be testing.
And I wanted to add something about Khan Academy. I apologize if I'm repeating things because I had to step out to deal with a situation really quick, but Khan Academy partners with College Board. So any test that College Board offers, AP, subject tests, SAT, they have the inside scoop on what's on those tests, and it's free. And kids tend to like Khan Academy if you can finally get them to create an account and actually go on, because a lot of it is visual too. So for all of our kids who are visual learners and love watching videos, it's a win-win, because that's what it is. So yeah, encourage Khan Academy for anything College Board related, because SalCon and College Board partnered. So it's the real deal.
Got a question right here? Yeah.
How many subject tests do you recommend for, like, if you're a junior, you should do like some honors AP classes? Would you recommend them taking so many this year, or save some for senior and some for junior? How many subject tests is it?
Yeah, it depends on the student, but a good complement would be 2 or 3. Yeah, very rarely do I see students with 4 or 5. That seems like a bit much. And so that focus, basically, if we're talking about a limited number of tests, then really we want something where this is a student's focus or their passion. And so a lot of times you'll see students that go, English and history, and they group it up that way, and other students that do math and science and group it up that way. I don't think I ever see students that take like 6 or anything like that. It seems overboard. I wouldn't do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Are the ACT and the SAT still paper and pencil tests, or is it?
Yep, SAT and ACT are still paper and pencil. They have to still bubble stuff in, and yep, it's a good old classic test.
It used to be, it seemed like there were some kids perform better on SAT and some on ACT. With the revamping of them, is it still that way?
So with the revamping, they've moved way closer together, and there are not very many differences anymore. And my suggestion is that students are going to hate this suggestion, is that they take both, or they take a diagnostic of both. They like wake up early on a Saturday morning one day and take a full-length SAT. Then the next Saturday they take a whole other ACT. But what I tell students to look for is not like their percentage better, or like, oh, I scored 1 point better on this test versus that test. Most students score about the same on both of the tests in terms of percentile. I like to tell students, well, what felt better? How did that science section feel? Did you actually enjoy it? Some students enjoy doing the science section and evaluate. They really do. Some students, the math section can be slightly different. The ACT brings their math up a little bit higher than the other ones. The SAT, some people say the math is easier but trickier. And some students that like puzzles maybe like the SAT math a little bit better. Other students that maybe did better in math in the classroom might like the ACT better. But I think it's mostly about the students' feeling and how they want to approach it, because they're going to be interacting with this test a lot, like through prep and stuff like that. And so if they feel more comfortable, or if they like some of the questions and they like the format of one test over the other, then I think that should be a big deciding factor. Anything else that I missed about the? Okay, cool. Yeah.
Is there any detriment to taking a test multiple times? For instance, let's say you scored, I don't know, like 1,400 the first time, and then your child says, oh, I'm going to take it again, and then they score 1,300, but then they take it again and they score 1,500. But you recommend sending all these to the schools. Do the colleges look at them and go, oh, that was kind of a dicey mess, or do they, what's the best?
The colleges are looking for the best out of your student. They are not going to focus on any lower scores. They're focusing on just the high scores, and they want to present your student with the best possible scenario. There's no detriment to sending all of their scores, even if they had a bad time. In terms of, the one thing that I would say for that kind of like roller coaster ride is that that schedule is pretty exhausting for your student, especially like maybe if they add a 4th test, like that's a lot. And so there is some anxiety that's built into the student if they're on that roller coaster ride of, oh, I prepped and I did well, and then, oh, school got busy and I didn't have time to prep, but I took it anyways and I scored worse, and oh my gosh, then I have to take it again. That's the thing that we're more worried about. Yeah.
Do you decide how many tests you want to send, or before you take the test, you put that name of the colleges and it goes automatically, or does it come to you and then you send it later?
So most of the time, the question was that how do students decide what test to send and stuff like that? Most of the time, students don't fill it out in the very beginning. Most of the time, they just take the test, and then when it comes time to send their scores in their senior year, for the SAT, there is technically a thing called score choice. Colleges don't like it, but students will use it. And basically, they can go in and they can choose the exact score that they want to send. And then they can send just one to the school. And so that exists. And some schools will require to see all of their test dates and all their test settings. And we tell them, just send everything, it's fine. Everything's gonna be okay. But it's very hard to get over that barrier of students thinking that they're going to be punished for that one low math score that one time that they sat down. So that's kind of the idea, that basically they send it in the fall of their senior year before their deadlines, and they choose to send their tests out to all of their schools.
Just a quick note about AP. I've had seniors say, oh, I took 3 on a particular AP, I'm probably going to send it. Well, they should send it, because if you take the class, you should take the test. Right, so the college will see that you took AP whatever, but you didn't take the test, or you didn't want to send it. So they really should, as we're saying, it's not going to punish. And they really should send all of their scores.
And you want to keep in mind the super score situation too. So if your son or daughter got a 1400 on one and a 1300 on another, but you know the math section was much higher in the 1300 one, now suddenly they have a 1480 or whatever. I'm not good with numbers, but you know. So just remember that piece too. So because colleges, we keep saying the same thing because we hear this from them all the time. They know, like that's just a Saturday morning. Maybe they woke up with a headache. Maybe they, you know, it doesn't cancel out the 4 years that they've worked so hard on everything else. So the colleges know and just want to see them put, you know, their best effort in. And they really do know, I promise, they really do know that this is just a test. The situation though is that when there's so many kids applying with very similar GPAs, they're always trying to also see what makes them look a little different, but that can be a lot of other things, not just the scores.
Yeah.
Do you
That's okay.
recommend more like retest, and would you recommend them having some in junior, like say one until senior, or just get it over before they start senior?
I think that different students will have different testing plans. The one thing that we do push them to have is sit down for a test, a real one, in the spring of your junior year. That's what we say, and then March, June, and just March, May, and June for the SAT, and the ACT has similar types of amounts. Yeah, and so we really say like, hey, sit down, plan to take that. Some students will be done. Some students will expand their plan to taking it during the senior year. We want to make sure that we're creating a testing plan that's individual to your student, that fits what they want, what they're reaching for. And so we're not just going to throw out a generic plan so that every student takes this. Students are going to be different. They're going to have different desires, and some of them will really, really want to study hard and try to get those extra 50 points to try and differentiate themselves with that school.
One thing I just wanted to tell you, if you guys are looking at the SAT dates and you're like, oh, they'll take it in June, be aware that that's June 1st, which is also our graduation day. And so if you have juniors and they have friends that are graduating and they want to go to graduation, just realize that's going to be a conflict. So, that's something we make sure to tell our juniors because they need to plan for that as well.
and also finals and stuff like that, and also pay attention to AP tests for some test dates, not the June one specifically, but there are other things going on in students' lives, and that could impact how they study and stuff like that. Some students in spring sports are like, no, I can't. Like, spring is a disaster, and so some of those students say, well, then maybe I'll take it even earlier, something like that. So it's all about finding the right time for a student to be able to take this and the best opportunity. Yeah.
And keeping in mind with those dates, those subject tests are on
Yeah.
those same dates too. So like you're suggesting, even in sophomore year, it makes sense to take a subject matter test if they're taking that content at that time.
The most common one that I would see in sophomore year would be that AP World History, taking the World History subject test. Otherwise, it's not unusual for a sophomore to not take any subject tests yet. So again, it's very based on the individual student. Yeah.
I was going to ask, I keep hearing about Math 2 subject tests, but not about Math 1, and I'm confused.
Yeah, good question. So Math 2 is like seriously advanced math. What's on Math 2?
It goes up through a little bit of trigonometry.
So basically, it goes beyond normal SAT math. It's hitting trig. It's hitting some elements of pre-cal. It could dip a little bit into some elements of calculus. And students that have taken calculus and AP Calculus and AP Calculus BC, they are expected to score really well on this Math 2 test. And so it's basically advanced math. And a lot of colleges, in terms of engineering, say, no, you need to know the advanced math stuff. And so actually the Math 2 subject test gets way more people taking it than the Math 1 subject test, because a lot of the time that information is mimicked on the SAT or the ACT, just through the math section in general. But Math 2 is advanced math and is a requirement for many engineering programs, almost all of them. And so that's why we talk about it a lot.
But what's Math 1 then?
Math 1 is a lower level of math. And because engineering schools and a lot of the students that are going into math and science, they are assumed to have already known Math 1, so they really need the more advanced math to show off to the colleges. And a lot of times Math 1 isn't taken as much because it's kind of redundant if you have a math score on your SAT or ACT. So it's not as popular of an exam. We have students that take Math 1 very often?
No.
Not very often.
Yeah.
I never have students taking Math 1. It's usually the more advanced one. Yeah.
You'd want to wait until senior year then, so they get that content.
Many students
You
do.
wouldn't be able to do it in
Some
fall
students can
either.
take it in their junior year if they feel prepared. There are resources, so a student can look at the concepts covered, and they can be like, yeah, I just took this, I get it, like I can take that. But many students are like, no, I just want as much math as possible, and then I'll take it in their senior year. But again, it's very based on the student. Yeah.
I guess following up on that, if you have a student who's interested in engineering but would be taking physics in his senior year, would you recommend that he wait on taking that, or self-teach himself physics in his junior year? And then I guess the next thing would be, do colleges, is that like an admission requirement, how well you do on the subject test? Can you find that information out on the internet? And do you need to know that before he applies?
Yeah, so if he's interested in engineering, many schools will require that Math 2 subject test. A lot of them, some of them will just say like science subject tests, but a lot of them will say specifically physics. And if a student hasn't taken physics yet, then that might mean that they're a little bit weak, so they'll want to put off the test as late as possible to have some classroom knowledge of physics and then complement that with physics subject test. So some studying might be more important for them. This is known throughout college because a lot of schools offer physics their senior year, and they know when the test dates happen. So this is a known quantity among colleges. And so it's all about finding the right time for a student to take it, looking up the specific requirements for the school, and again, trying to match what's good for the student, what the student's schedule is, what the school requires, and then what would be best. So there is a little bit of a puzzle putting together this testing stuff to make sure that everything is in the right place.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I also wanted to know, like, do you have to, like, if you have great SAT scores, great grades, and do you still need to know, like, I need to know my grade, my score on the physics test, because that will tell me should I apply to, you know, Berkeley engineering as opposed to?
Oh, whether you need to have the result on that to know your chances. So if you're applying for engineering, your score on subject tests, yeah, it matters. We have a lot of students that apply. A lot of students go into the test knowing about what they're going to score already. They know that they're confident in their ability to perform that, and so a lot of times they know that they're applying to the school without that piece of the puzzle to know what their subject test score is. And so hopefully it's not blind and they're just throwing dice out and say, well, maybe I'll get the right score or maybe I won't. So hopefully they'll have some idea, and so it won't base their college choice off of their score, specifically for their subject test. But yeah, some students have a plan in place and they want to go to Berkeley, and then they get their subject scores back and they're like, might be a little bit disappointed because they're not as competitive as they would normally. We still think they should apply. If they've decided to apply to that school, apply, send your scores, do everything. But yeah, sometimes when the test scores come in, the numbers aren't exactly where you want it, and then we start making sure that the students have other options. That's why we have a comprehensive college list. So if those scores come back and they're not exactly what the student wants, well, their college list is built for that. They have target schools where that's going to be fine. They have safety schools that they're happy with, they'll also be fine with. And we can again adjust their list to make sure that they have colleges that kind of fit theirs. Does that answer your question a little bit?
And how quickly do you get the scores back?
A month. Yeah.
Yeah, and just because engineering has come up a few times, I think in general for engineering students, again, it depends on the types of schools that a student's applying to, but math is what they want to focus on. You know, like we had Michigan here earlier in the year and they said, you know, you have to have a 4th year of science, have to have a 4th year of math. They want to see calculus. I mean, there's you know, they just want to see every part of math. You know, just maximizing the opportunities that we have here in math, the grades in math, the test scores in math, the subject test. So that's why all those pieces are something that we talk about with engineering students, because again, the choices they have in colleges vary widely and we want them to have variety, but to be competitive, we just say, really focus on your math. You know, that's a big thing. So just as a general piece of advice, that's something they'll.
I think there was a question back in this direction a little bit.
And then we might have to, it's 9 o'clock, so we'll take one more.
1 and 2,
One,
and then
two,
we go.
and
Oh, I just had, I wanted to tag on to her question earlier. It's my first time to actually find out about the subject test. So, what do you do if you miss the boat? So my daughter is a junior. She took the AP World History, and I think she took the AP test, but she did not take the subject test. Where do we go from there?
It's if they feel confident in the ability to perform well on that, they can just go ahead and sign up for the subject test, do a little bit of review. She should have a lot of that knowledge kind of established right now. But again, like, I don't think it's a disaster. I don't think she missed the boat. I think there's plenty of opportunities for her to take exams and have a good complement of subject tests. And so I don't think that they're behind in any case, but there's no reason why she can't sign up to take the World History test in the spring or in a couple months.
But it is your suggestion that for every AP class that they take, they have to take an AP test and a subject test?
Some students, some schools will be looking for subject tests. And so matching that up with your AP tests could be an easy way to fulfill that requirement. And also, if a student is excited about a subject, then they can demonstrate it through AP classes and then also subject tests. Subject tests are required for some of those top schools, but the average student doesn't really need them. And students will be just fine without them or just fine with one. I think the most critical piece is in that situation where a student has an AP class, that demonstrates the mastery in world history really, really well, much better than the subject test. And if a student has let's say that they're not in AP US history right now. They might not be, but they love US history and they do really well at it. They do well in the normal class. They could demonstrate their knowledge and their love for history by then taking the subject test in US history. I think we might have scared you a little bit about the subject tests.
Yeah, I worry about all this discussion of subject tests because, to be honest, most of our kids don't even take subject tests.
And they're totally fine.
Subject tests are for the most selective schools, and even they say now they're recommended, not required, but that's because of access. And so at a school like Chaminade, those schools that say recommended, not required, we say that but that's the top echelon. The UCs used to require them, they don't anymore. And then you have those particular majors like engineering where they say, yes, we want to see those. But most of our kids don't even take a subject test. And I'm worried about all the numbers that people are talking about, because you can sit for up to 3 in one day, and colleges usually say we want to see 2, maybe 3. So not 5, not every AP they've ever taken, just the things they feel most their strengths are in. Those areas their strengths are in are the ones where they should focus on. And again, the Khan Academy, the test prep, reviewing the concepts, knowing what's going to be the focus on the test will help them brush up, because they did take that class. It doesn't disappear. So, so don't relax. And we have just one more quick
I can
question.
ask my question now.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and that's another thing, is that we will be all here answering questions individually, and I want to thank you so much for coming today and learning about this one.